Namo Buddhaya.
Namo Buddhaya.
Namo Dharmaya.
Namo Dharmaya.
Namo Sanghaya.
Namo Sanghaya.
Namo Namah.
Namo Namah.
Om. Om. So hello to those of you joining us online. Good morning to everyone else. So this is our last full day of the retreat, and we're going to have two presentations, one from myself, one from Prajnaketu, just looking at two actually precepts, and then we'll go into our study discussion. But what we'd like to happen this morning is, besides looking at these specific precepts, also taking a bit of an overview, what has stood out for us from our meeting with Atisha, Drom, and their disciples. And also, are there any precepts that we're going to be taking away? What have these teachings mirrored back to us as our next step? So we're going to have looked at about 10 precepts, I think, 10 of these Kadampa precepts. There's another in the text. Some actually of the others are very short, and they're mostly Drom's disciples and their disciples. I do think probably the real essence of the teaching is actually gathered in these earlier precepts from Atisha and Drom. But I certainly hope you're going to be encouraged to go back to the text. The Door of Liberation has been republished. I showed you that very early 70s edition. It has been republished in a much later edition. And then also to the seminar and Bhante's commentary on the text. There's just riches both in the text and the seminar, I think, still to be mined, contemplated, returned to again and again. And there's also the hope that you're going to have gained enough from this retreat to think about sharing the text and studying it with others, maybe chapter, other order members, literers. And on our resources page for this retreat, which will be available still to you all when you get home, I think you probably all get an email with it, with a link again once the retreat's over. So you'll find all the precepts that we've been studying with the commentary, extracts, and there'll be some special bonus precepts as well that we didn't get time to study that are there. And there are these seminar extracts with the precepts, but do think about going back to the seminar yourself, and there may be things there that stand out for you. I just picked out the commentary and questions that stood out for me. So it's always good to go back to the source. There's also on our resources page, there's a couple of images of Atisha that can be downloaded, and there'll be a reading tonight that'll be up there, and there's an outline of the Bodhicitta practice. So you've got available a sort of starter pack if you want to actually follow up with these Kadampa precepts and share them with others. Not just to rely just on that. Do go back to the original text and the seminar, but I think it gives you a good sort of starter if you want to explore the material with others. Okay, so today's precepts are numbers 12 and 13. So as I said yesterday, they're not numbered in the text. It's just that this is the actual order you find them in the text. So it just helps to work out where they come from. So I'm going to start with number 13 and then Prajnaketu will look at 12. So, what is the difference between Dharma and non-Dharma? The teacher Drom was asked by Potawa. If something is in opposition to fettering passions, it is Dharma. If it is not Dharma. If it does not accord with worldly people, it is Dharma. If it does accord, it is not Dharma. If it accords with the teachings of Buddha, it is Dharma. If it does not accord, it is not Dharma. If good follows, it is Dharma. If bad follows, it is not Dharma. So that probably reminds many of you of that encounter of the Buddha with Prajapati, his stepmother, who'd brought him up after his own mother died soon after his birth, and who actually became the first nun in the early Sangha, and actually someone of very great spiritual attainment. And that incident where she asked the Buddha for that, what is the essence of his teachings? So I'll just read that account. This is from the Anguttara Nikaya. I think it may be found elsewhere, but it's there in the Anguttara Nikaya in the section of the Eights. It would be good, Lord, if the Blessed One would teach me the Dharma in brief, so that having heard the Dharma from the Blessed One, I might dwell alone, withdrawn, diligent, ardent, and resolute. When Gautami, you know of certain things. These things lead to passion, not to dispassion, to bondage, not to detachment, to accumulation, not to diminution, to have many wishes, not to having few wishes, to discontent, not to contentment, to gregariousness, not to seclusion, to indolence, not to the arousing of energy, to luxurious living, not to frugality. Of such things you can be certain. This is not Dhamma. This is not the discipline. This is not the Master's teaching. But Gautami, when you know of certain things, these things lead to dispassion, not to passion, to detachment, not to bondage, to diminution, not to accumulation, to having few wishes, not having many wishes, to contentment, not to discontent, to seclusion, not to gregariousness, to the arousing of energy, not to indolence, to frugality, not to luxurious living. Of such things you can be certain. This is the Dhamma. This is the discipline. This is the Master's teaching. So yes, in those early days of the Buddhist Sangha, the Buddha taught, his teachings were remembered and they would get passed on. But things hadn't got properly sort of organised. It took a while still for the whole process of checking and, as it were, confirming the reliability of report. So there would have been lots of reports, maybe even different versions of the Buddha's teaching in circulation. And it's as if Prajapati Gautami, she just wanted, well, what is the essence of it? There's already all these different versions around. What's the essence of it that I can just reflect on? And the Buddha gave these very essential guidelines to her. So Atisha went to Tibet, and he knew a lot. He was a great Buddhist scholar. He'd been training in the Dharma and all sorts of teachings for many, many years. But here he was in wild and woolly Tibet. The sense of time was short. He had to make the most of it. So he had to decide what amongst all that he knew was going to be most helpful, most effective to share with the people of Tibet. And there were probably all sorts of ideas and teachings around, including perhaps some slightly skewed versions of Buddhism, that had just got a little bit confused over time. So certainly there was enough sort of confusion around for Drom to be asked this question by one of his chief disciples. And he gave this very simple, direct answer. If something is in opposition to fettering passions, it's Dharma. If it's not Dharma. If it does not accord with worldly people, it's Dharma. If it does accord, it's not Dharma. If it accords with the teachings of Buddha, it is Dharma. If it does not accord, it is not Dharma. If good follows, it is Dharma. If bad follows, it is not Dharma. So yes, a simple, direct answer. And it's this question put to the Buddha by Mahaprajapati and put to Drom by Potawa. It's a question we might well ask ourselves. There's just so many teachings, so many religious traditions, so many versions of Buddhism about it, can be overwhelming. So how do we make sure that this is the true Dharma? How do we make sure we are actually engaged with and practicing the true Dharma? So opposed to fettering passions, it actually challenges our greed, our hatred, our pride, our confusion. It challenges us to face them and meet them. That's a sign of true Dharma. It doesn't sort of pat us on the back and say, you're doing fine, carry on. It actually challenges us again and again to face the kleshas, face the fettering patterns, and engage with them, as we've seen over these past days. Then it's not in accord with worldly people, not in accord with worldly values. And we can see, I think, very clearly how many religious traditions or religions are compromised by wealth, power, status, so that they can't be too challenging. There's things that they just can't challenge and question because it sort of might put them in opposition to the politicians and to upset their position in society. So again, it's and then just on a much more everyday level. Well, the world is so much with us, getting and spending. We lay waste our powers. It's this sense that worldly values just are there. They run through us. They run in us. We're so much influenced by the world around us. And are we able to see that? And are we able to make sure those, if you like, worldly values and securities and certainties that we look for there aren't feeding into our Dharma practice. And then the teachings are in accord with the teachings of the Buddha. So yes, this is a job of work, isn't it, to actually find out, be clear, what are the teachings of the Buddha. Bhante's always had a very strong feeling for the historic Buddha and has spoken of his teachings as the touchstone for our whole tradition. But again, what Bhante's concern was, if you like, to get back to those teachings in their original clarity and freshness, to actually see through, maybe a sort of crust that had sometimes gathered over them just over the course of the centuries and formalization and all the other things that go on in time. And then if good follows, not bad. So I think here we might need to add, we need to take the long view. I think that's a theme that's come up a few times, certainly in our discussions. It's there as well in some of those precepts we've looked at. The long view. Did he say? Teacher say, don't think in terms of weeks and months and years. Just get on with your practice. Don't keep trying to measure it. And yes, taking the long view. I just was thinking how certainly in the 60s, 70s, 80s, there were lots of new teachings around teachers, movements. There was Scientology, there was the Divine Light Mission, there was Rajneesh, later Osho. And what one saw there was often people met these teachings and there was an initial burst of inspiration and enthusiasm, a sort of letting go of old habits and assumptions, and something actually was really happening for them. But then the question is, can the momentum be sustained? You don't do the teachings, does the context have what it needs to actually sustain an effective and deepening spiritual life, or, is something lacking? Does it go awry? Do people settle down? Or is there that steady, deepening, clarifying process of transformation? So yes, we need to be able to see if good follows, not bad, but also have the long view. And the sense it is a bumpy, often up and down journey that we're on, and it's the sustainability of that journey and that a process of a clarification of the good and a movement away from the bad. Sometimes dramatic, sometimes just very gradual. But actually that's another very significant measure of whether or not it's true Dharma. So yes, we need to really actually make sure we keep alive that radical edge, which texts like these Kadampa precepts, they really challenge us to do that, to keep alive this radical edge to our Dharma practice, not settle down, not get lazy, not get distracted from the task. And yes, a sense of patient work, even over lifetimes. But at the same time, again, there's this sort of paradoxical message. It's patient work, even over lifetimes, but at the same time, this sense of urgency of really making the most of this precious, fleeting opportunity that this human life offers us here and now. So yeah, a real question, are we practicing a living Dharma, or have we settled into a worthy but limited version of it? What are we practicing? What are we sharing with others? And this really just brings us back to much of what we've been looking at in those earlier precepts so far. So that's this precept. I'm now going to hand over to Prajnaketu to look at the second of our precepts for this morning.
Thanks, Saddhaloka. Yes, so this is this precept number 12 is the precepts that gave us the title of this retreat, as you'll see as I read through. So one day, an old gentleman was circumambulating the Radreng monastery. Geshe Drom said to him, "Sir, I am happy to see you circumambulating, but wouldn't you rather be practicing the Dharma?" Thinking this over, the old gentleman felt it might be better to read Mahayana sutras. While he was reading in the temple courtyard, Geshe Drom said, "I'm happy to see you reciting sutras, but wouldn't you rather be practicing the Dharma?" At this, the old gentleman thought that perhaps he should meditate. He sat cross-legged on a cushion with his eyes half closed. The teacher Drom said again, "I'm so happy to see you meditating, but wouldn't it be better to practice the Dharma?" Now totally confused, the old gentleman asked, "Geshe La, please tell me what I should do to practice the Dharma." The teacher Drom replied, "Renounce attraction to this life. Renounce it now. For if you do not renounce attraction to this life, whatever you do will not be the practice of Dharma, as you have not passed beyond the 8 worldly concerns. Once you have renounced this life's habitual thoughts and are no longer distracted by the 8 worldly concerns, whatever you do will advance you on the path of liberation." So it's a lovely story, this, isn't it? I just love the idea of this sort of old gentleman who's very sort of earnest, very sincere, and is wanting to follow the teaching, practice the Dharma, and he's evidently receptive to what Drom is saying. He's receptive to his teacher, and then you've got this sort of wonderful sort of rapport, in a way you can imagine, that Drom has with this chap. He's sort of saying, "Sir," I love the courteousness of that, "Sir, I'm happy to see you circumambulating, but wouldn't you rather be practicing the Dharma?" It's got a ring of, as Saddhaloka was saying previously, that precept has a ring of the Buddha and Maha Prajapati. This is more like Vimalakirti, isn't it? It's the Vimalakirti where there's the reluctance of the disciples and the bodhisattvas to go and visit Vimalakirti, and they'll sort of say, "Well, one day I was, I don't know, meditating or tying my shoelaces or whatever," and then Vimalakirti came along and said effectively this, "I'm very happy to see you, whatever, but wouldn't you rather be practicing the Dharma?" So I got a few things to say about this. It's not a long precept, but I think a lot of this constellates around literalism. So I've probably used the word literalism a fair bit already in what I've said, and we talk about it a lot. The way I understand literalism is as a belief that our concepts correspond with some essence really existing in the world. So literalism is where we believe that our concepts correspond with some essence, some essential thing in the world. Something we can kind of point to, which is unchanging and, a fact. And this is literalism. I should say literalism is, I'd say it's one of the characteristics of unenlightenment. One of the sort of trademarks, hallmarks of unenlightened existence is that we literalize. So it's going to be inevitable. We're going to be doing it one way or another. And I think, what Drom's illustrating here is the importance of being receptive to somebody coming in and just pointing out where we're doing it. Yeah. In this particular case, the literalism is with regard to practices. It's thinking that a particular practice or a particular activity is essentially dharmic. So this guy, he's this old gentleman, he's circumambulating, he's reading, he's meditating. Well, in fact, actually, he's not really meditating. He's sitting cross-legged on a cushion with his eyes half closed. I think we've all been there, haven't we? Yeah. Just there's the sitting with the eyes half closed and eyes crossed. Legs crossed, eyes half closed. And is there meditation going on? But it's this identification or this belief that that outward activity constitutes an essential Dharma. It constitutes Dharma practice, essentially. And where I want to go with this is a distinction which often comes in, and it comes in the previous precept, and it comes in a fair bit in the way we talk in Triratna as well. It's a distinction between worldly and spiritual. Let's just use those terms, so worldly and spiritual. And when literalism is brought into these concepts, we get things like the worldly being identified with mortgage, family, work, Netflix, the internet in general, and spiritual being identified with, meditation, cups of tea with mitras, sutra reading, going on retreats, working in a team-based right livelihood, those kind of things. And we sort of imagine that those are intrinsically either worldly or spiritual. Hopefully I don't need to say that's delusion, but I think we do need to go into why that is a little bit. The consequence, this is again a bit like what we were saying before, in terms of, does good follow from this? Well, no. If we're literalizing these activities in this way, I think at least two things happen. So one is that we end up disparaging the worldly, even if we're doing it, even if we're caught up in the worldly, inverted commas, we end up disparaging it and sort of living a life which is turned against itself somehow. It can be very unpleasant and undermining to ourselves and even undermining to others if we adopt this kind of literalism. But then if perhaps we identify more with the spiritual activities, we get conceit, we get complacency, neither of which are helping anyone. Basically, that's what happens when we literalize activities in this way. And this is what this old gentleman is doing in this story. It's not like he's doing it out of malice or out of delusion. He's very sincere, but he just finds himself literalizing spiritual practice. What's a better way of looking at this rather than identifying particular activities with the worldly or with the spiritual? Well, I think there's a clue in this text, and it takes the form of the 8 worldly concerns, the 8 loka dharma, or the worldly attitudes, I think, is sometimes another way of translating it. Worldly wins is the probably more famous one. So you have praise and blame, fame, and it could, whatever the opposite of fame is. It could be what did I say here? Sort of disgrace, infamy, obscurity. They seem to be opposites of fame. Then you've got pleasure and pain, and then gain and loss. I think those are the 8. I always struggle to remember them because they sound similar, don't they? There's always the same vowel sound in one of them. Anyway, that gives a much more reliable criterion for judging whether our activities are worldly or spiritual. Insofar as we are motivated by the 8 worldly concerns, it could mean that our spiritual activities, in inverted commas, our spiritual activities are worldly. We're looking for praise or fame in relation to what we're doing, or we're trying to use our spiritual practice to sort of get away from a pain, or get away from whatever another opposite might be, loss. That brings a nuance in, a really helpful nuance, I think, in looking at what's worldly, what's spiritual. I was thinking a bit about this. Partly, I was reading Vajragupta's book on the 8 worldly winds yesterday, and he offers a sort of a way of kind of going beyond each of the those poles of the worldly, those pairs. I like what he says. I really like what Vajragupta says there, and I think I'd also like to transplant it more into the idiom of Atisha and what he's talking about as well. So the way it seems to me is that actually the first 4 paramitas offer a gateway beyond these poles. So, for example, generosity, that's straight out of Vajragupta actually. Generosity is the antidote to relying on gain and loss as our reference points. Shila, ethics, the sense of judging our actions on the basis of how it transforms our minds, how it refines and expands and enriches our minds. That's a better reference point than whether I get praise or blame for it. So sila is a sort of way beyond praise and blame. Kashanti, patience, this forbearance. Again, it's a way of relating to life which isn't pulled and pushed by pleasure and pain. 4th one I'm not so sure about, but in some way, and maybe you can check this out in your groups, I think virya is an antidote to the fame, disgrace pole. It's like sort of somehow getting on with it, rather than being motivated by its the way it impresses other people or not. Maybe that's an antidote to that pole, those 2 poles. That's a way maybe of couching spiritual activity insofar as it is, it's supporting our attitudes of generosity, ethics, kashanti and virya, and meditation and wisdom as well coming out of that. What Drom says, I mean, he's quite strong here, isn't he? He says when he's asked, well, please tell me what I should do to practice the Dharma. Drom's response is, renounce attraction to this life, renounce it now. It's like, oof. I'd love to know what you think about what he means by attraction to this life. I think speaking of it in terms of the 8 worldly concerns is one way of looking at it. But you might also think, well, what is it that when you are in the process of dying, when I am in the process of dying, what is it will keep me here, or sort of will be a real kind of, I don't know, it will prevent me from really letting go into death. Yeah. And it's likely to be along the lines of gain and loss, praise and blame, pleasure, pain, etc. But maybe it's something less formulaic, something quite specific to you of what would be keeping you from having a clean death. Say a couple more things. So in Bante's commentary, he goes into the spiral path. So he's talking about renunciation as nissarana. So sarana meaning going for refuge, as in buddhang saranang gacchami, it's the same word. So nissaranang is not going for refuge to the worldly concerns in this particular case. And that's a consequence of knowledge and vision of things as they are. So that arises in dependence upon knowledge and vision of things as they really are in that path. And again, so we've got this ascent, haven't we? Starting from either dukkha or starting from skillful action, working its way through more and more sort of blissful states of mind to jnana, yata bhuta jnana darshana, I think is the phrase, isn't it? Knowledge and vision of things as they really are. And then that descends through renunciation, through this dispassion, disentanglement, and into freedom. So it's a similar pattern again, isn't it? The ascending and descending. Right, the last thing I want to say is adding a little bit more nuance to this spiritual worldly duality. So while I don't believe there are intrinsically spiritual or intrinsically worldly activities, nevertheless, the spiritual activities do have a big role. I think that the main thing with this is that these sort of spiritual activities, even the ones that the old gentleman's talking about or trying to do here, they at least serve to remind us of what we're trying to do. Yeah. And this is, I think this is really key to the symbolism of Drom here in this passage. Like, Drom isn't just it's not just a kind of historical account of Drom's slightly comical interaction with this old gentleman. Drom here is standing for the fact that spiritual activities will constantly remind us of what our aims are. Yeah. They remind us. They help us to stay in touch with, in this particular case, this renunciation of the attraction to this life. In a way, I'd like to say a lot more about this, but I haven't quite sort of worked it out. It's something about the context in which we're doing all of these practices. Insofar as there is a healthy living context there, each of our activities won't be merely techniques, but they will be pointing to that context. So I don't know, I'm doing the mindfulness of breathing, and I'm stuck in, let's call it sort of X-rated prapancha. And okay, I can open my eyes and I look around the shrine room, and there are my brothers and sisters in the Dharma. There's the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. There's even just my breath, like all of that within the context of this spiritual activity is reminding me of, I'm looking to go beyond the worldly concerns. I'm looking to transcend those. It's a bit like this sort of going on retreat, and here we are. I should say, for the benefit of people on Zoom, on our table in the dining room, there are two bits of A4 paper which say, "Wouldn't it be better to practice the Dharma?" And it's like, the conversation starts to go south on over dinner, and somebody then can hold up this sign saying, "Wouldn't it be better to practice the Dharma?" It's like the characteristic of spiritual activities, insofar as it has a characteristic, is to keep us on track, to remind us, this is what we are about. This is what we're trying to do. Whereas with more in inverted commas, worldly activities, it's like I'm stuck in this X-rated prapancha, or maybe you don't have X-rated prapancha, maybe it's more like PG-13 prapancha or whatever. It's a bit sort of tamer, I don't know. But with worldly activities, it's like they go, up next. So, recommended for you, more of the same, whereas, so there is this difference. Basically, the spiritual activities do make it easier for the voice of Drom to speak to us. It's not anything intrinsic to them, but they're sort of shaped in such a way that Geshe Drom can exhort us to renounce attraction to this life. Let's leave that there. Okay, so we will go into a tea break now for 20 minutes, and then we'll return to our groups. See you then.